Forgotten testimonies of tortures hidden by royals. They say history is written by the victors, but it is also erased by them. For centuries, royal families across Europe, Asia, and beyond crafted their own versions of events, weaving myths of divine right and noble sacrifice, while silencing anything that revealed their cruelty. Among the shadows of their palaces and dungeons were voices that once screamed, whispered, and confessed under torment. Testimonies of suffering that were recorded only to be locked away, burned, or buried with the dead. Yet fragments of these voices linger, and when pieced together, they form a chilling mosaic of power, silence, and pain. One such testimony comes from a chamber beneath a palace in Spain, written in a trembling hand on scraps of parchment smuggled out by a servant. It tells of a young man accused of heresy, though his only crime had been speaking too freely about the king's mistress. For this, he was lowered into a device known as la cuna, the cradle, an iron frame lined with jagged edges where he was rocked back and forth until his flesh split and his bones cracked. His words described the moment he realized the torturers were not seeking truth but obedience. He confessed to blasphemies he had never uttered, crimes he had never committed, only to hear the court scribes mutter that it would be better if his testimony was not recorded. What remained was his note, smuggled out before his body vanished. The official records list him as silence before trial. In France, during the reign of a queen who was praised for her elegance and wit, another testimony was written in secret. This one belonged to a wet nurse accused of poisoning the royal infant when he fell sick. She had cared for him since birth, her own body sacrificed to feed the boy who would be king. Yet when he developed a fever, suspicion turned toward her. They placed her in the pain forte et dure, weight stacked upon her chest until her ribs bent and her breath grew shallow. A priest recorded her gasps as proof of confession, though she never uttered guilt. The testimony that survived came not from her, but from another nurse, who scrawled in the margins of a prayer book that the woman's last words were not of poison, but betrayal. I gave him milk, and now they give me stone. The royal court's annals describe her death as natural, erased of torture, her name forgotten. In the East, in the palace of a sultan, a testimony was etched not in ink but in bone. Prisoners who were forced into the zindan, a pit where they starved in darkness, were sometimes given shards of broken pottery. One captive, a physician accused of withholding a cure from the royal family, carved his words into his own femur before he died, using blood to stain the letters. His message was simple: I cannot heal the plague, but I am made into the plague. His bones were found years later, hidden among others, and though his name was stripped from history, his testimony survived in the most grotesque archive imaginable. In England, whispers tell the testimony dictated by a noblewoman accused of witchcraft. She had been subjected to the scavenger's daughter, a crushing device that folded the body in upon itself, forcing blood from nose, ears, and eyes. Between sessions, she whispered to her guard, a boy barely in his teens, who secretly memorized her words and later repeated them to a priest. She described how the queen's advisors delighted in her contorted form, not because they believed her guilty, but because her broken body was meant as a warning to other women who dared defy the crown. The official account states she died peacefully, a repentant sinner, but the priest's private letters tell another story. Her final words were a curse that the queen's bloodline would suffer madness. Strangely enough, history records that it did. And then there is a testimony from a kingdom in the north where winter never seemed to end. In this account, which survives only in fragments, a group of rebels were kept in an underground hall where ice itself became their torment. They were chained naked against frozen walls, their skin tearing and fusing to the frost, their screams muffled by the howling winds above. One man scratched his testimony into the stone with his teeth after his fingers blackened and fell away. He wrote not of politics or guilt, but of silence, the silence of those who knew what was happening above yet feasted in warm halls, singing of the king's mercy. His frozen words were only uncovered centuries later when the dungeon collapsed, revealing a wall etched with desperate marks. Scholars debated whether the scratches were random or deliberate, but those who looked closely swore they saw words. We were never heard. What binds all these testimonies together is not just the cruelty of the torturers, but the deliberate burial of their memory. Royal chroniclers were ordered to record victories, banquets, marriages, and births, but never the groans echoing from beneath the stone floors. Torturers themselves were sworn to secrecy, often executed once their services were no longer useful, ensuring that no one could reveal the truth. Yet memory is not so easily erased. It lingers in marginalia, in bones, in forgotten walls, in whispers passed from servant to servant. The royals who hid these tortures believed they had erased shame from their legacies, crafting a history polished and gilded, free of stain. But when one listens carefully, beneath the triumphs and coronations, there are echoes, a cradle creaking on rusted hinges, stones pressing down on a woman's chest, the rattle of a pit filled with bones, the hiss of frozen air against human flesh, and words, faint but unrelenting. We were here, we suffered, and you tried to forget us. The forgotten testimonies remind us that power thrives on silence, but silence is never complete. Even when kings and queens order their histories rewritten, they could not kill every witness. Pain itself became the historian, carving records into flesh and stone, leaving traces that no royal decree could fully destroy. It is in those traces that the true history lives, not in the gilded chronicles of monarchs, but in the broken, blood-stained words of the silenced. Then there are the testimonies too disturbing to be spoken aloud, passed instead in secret, hidden in prayers, carried like ghosts in ink and ash. One comes from Italy, where a duke infamous for his banquets kept a subterranean chamber he called the Hall of Reflection. Guests believed it was a wine cellar, but servants knew it was something else, a place where enemies of the crown were stripped, coated in oil, and placed inside hollow bronze sculptures shaped like saints. These statues were then heated from beneath until the prisoners inside screamed so loudly the echoes shook the stone. A monk, forced to bless the condemned before their punishment, scribbled in his Bible margins that the cries sounded like hymns turned inside out, and he begged God to deafen him. His testimony was smuggled out when he died, but the Duke's archivist seized it and burned it. Only a single page survived, found centuries later in a convent library, the ink smeared by tears. Another tale comes from Russia, where czars rule with frost and iron. Testimonies from Siberian mines speak of the Iron Veil, a punishment that never appeared in any official decree. Prisoners were forced to wear masks of iron that froze to their skin in winter, burning and tearing the flesh with each breath. A soldier tasked with guarding them wrote secretly to his brother, "They no longer speak in words, only in blood. The masks drink it in." His letter was intercepted and hidden in the Tsar's archives, but not before his brother made a copy, hiding it inside the lining of his boots. Those boots were discovered in a grave more than a century later, the words still legible, testifying to torment long forgotten. In Austria, there was a queen celebrated for her piety, who demanded that no man or woman should be punished without a confession. What is not recorded in official histories is how those confessions were extracted. Her torturers invented a method they called the angel's wings, chains attached to the arms and pulled back until bones cracked and splintered. One prisoner, a scholar accused of spreading dangerous ideas, begged for ink to write his repentance. They gave him ink, believing he would sign away his guilt, but instead he wrote a detailed account of what was done to him. Each crack of his bones, each scream he was forced to release. The record was confiscated, the scholar executed, but a servant tasked with cleaning the chamber later scratched 3 words into stone floor where he had sat. Wings made hell. Not all testimonies were written. Some were sung, whispered, memorized by those too afraid to hold pen or parchment. In Hungary, peasants taken by the crown for rebelling were subjected to what was called the cage of silence. A man or woman would be locked into a spiked cage hung from the palace walls, left to starve as crows picked at their flesh. Those who lived nearby began to sing laments of the victims at night, the words forbidden but carried across the fields. One survivor, released after 3 days, told her daughter the verses. The song passed through generations, disguised as a lullaby, until centuries later someone realized the rhythm matched the moans of a woman dying in a cage. The testimony lived on not in ink, not in bone, but in the voices of children who had no idea of the horror in their song. But perhaps the most unsettling testimony comes from a place where no record should have survived at all. In a small German state, a young boy was accused of mocking the royal family. During a festival, he was dragged beneath the palace and placed in an iron chair heated by coals. He was no older than 12. There should have been nothing left of him. No voice, no words, no remains. And yet, when excavators uncovered the chamber centuries later, they found the outline of his hand burned into the stone wall. On the wall above it, faint but visible, were letters scratched by his nails before the fire consumed him. They spelled one word: remember. Scholars debate if the word is real or a trick of erosion, but to those who have stood in that chamber, the silence feels heavier than stone, as though the boy's command lingers in the air itself. All of these voices, burned, broken, erased, were meant to be forgotten. Kings and queens believed they could scrub their reigns clean of such horrors, that history could be polished into marble and gold. But marble cracks, gold tarnishes, and beneath, the bones and whispers remain. Every hidden testimony is a reminder that power always demands silence, yet silence never holds forever. The testimonies seep through cracks, through songs, through stone and blood. They remind us that behind every royal banquet, there were screams. Behind every crown, there was a chain. Behind every celebration of divine right, there was a body broken in darkness. The forgotten testimonies of torture are not just history. They are warnings. Warnings that what is erased does not vanish. It waits, it festers, and it whispers until someone listens. And if no one listens, it becomes louder in its silence, pressing against the walls of time until they shatter, and the truth floods out unbearable, undeniable. There is one testimony that has only recently begun to circulate among scholars, though even they refuse to publish it in official journals. It comes from a collection of charred manuscripts found in a locked chest buried beneath an abbey in Bohemia. The papers were blackened, the edges crisp with fire, as though someone had tried to burn them but had not succeeded entirely. What remains is a fragmented narrative written by a man who identifies himself only as the recorder. His task, he explains, was not to judge guilt or innocence, but to record the words forced from men and women as they were tortured under royal order. He writes that he was chosen for his steady hand, for the way his ink did not blot, and for his silence. For years, he transcribed the cries and confessions of countless souls, his record stored in a hidden archive where no common eyes would see. But slowly, his writings became more than transcripts. In the margins, he began to note the way eyes rolled back into skulls, the smell of flesh after the rack pulled too far, the way bones sounded when splintered against steel. He described the queen's face when she came to witness certain punishments, not of pity or anger, but of something closer to curiosity. He confessed that at times he heard voices in the ink, as if the victim's agony had bled through his quill, staining the words with something alive. He begged whatever reader might find his notes to forgive him, for he did not just write their confessions. He kept their screams. Somewhere deep in the wreck of the documents, amid the stains of ash and blood, one line repeats again and again: "The words will not die." Another testimony emerges from Scandinavia, from the icy halls of a fortress where prisoners were kept not to extract truth, but to entertain royalty. The king and his retinue would gather in a chamber called a gallery of red windows, where captives were paraded and subjected to slow mutilations while the nobles feasted. The glass panes of the windows were dyed crimson so that, to outsiders, the chamber glowed as if bathed in eternal sunset. A servant who later fled the kingdom described how one prisoner, a sailor accused of piracy, bit off his own tongue to deny the torturers their spectacle. He spat it at the king's feet, and the blood sprayed against the glass, making the sunset redder. The servant carried that memory across the sea, whispering it in taverns until he too disappeared. His testimony is not found in books, but in the oral tales of sailors who still murmur when storms strike, "Beware the red windows." The strangest testimonies are those that seem almost impossible, and yet are whispered with such detail they cannot be ignored. In Poland, an account was discovered etched on thin sheets of lead buried beneath a ruined tower. It tells of prisoners who were subjected to a contraption the chronicler called the Bell of Silence. Victims were placed beneath a great iron dome, which was struck repeatedly with hammers, sending waves of unbearable sound through their skulls. The chronicler described how men begged for knives or fire instead, how their eyes bled and their jaws shattered as they screamed against the noise. The testimony claims that after hours inside the bell, the victims no longer spoke in words, but in strange rhythmic utterances, their minds reshaped by sound. The chronicler insisted that he, too, began to hear those patterns in his dreams, long after leaving the tower. He ended his testimony with a warning: the silence is never silent again. In the Ottoman court, a testimony survives not in words, but in a pattern of wounds carved into flesh. A eunuch, accused of betraying the harem, was subjected to a punishment that the official record described as purification. His body was flayed in strips so precise and deliberate that the scars formed letters across his skin. Though he was kept alive for weeks, his body eventually failed. Before he died, he begged a physician to copy the letters. What emerged was a message written across the canvas of his body, a fragmented prayer. If God does not see me here, then let men remember. The physician who preserved those words was executed, his family scattered, and yet the pattern remained, whispered in secret medical circles, until someone, centuries later, repeated it aloud. It is said that to hear those words spoken is to feel a tightening in the chest, as if the body itself remembers. In the German states, a testimony came from a jester, a man who had once been the king's amusement, permitted to speak freely in jest. But when his jokes cut too close to truth, he was silenced with the very tools he had mocked. They placed him on a device that twisted his spine until he was bent into a permanent bow. He lived for months after, crawling like an insect through the palace, forced to serve wine at banquets. His testimony survives in riddles carved into wooden cups, where he scratched warnings no one took seriously. The crown laughs last, and it laughs in pain. When those cups were found centuries later, historians dismissed them as superstition, but the bend of his spine was real. His body discovered buried in the palace gardens. His bones were folded like a broken instrument. And still, there are darker whispers, stories that blur the line between testimony and curse. In Portugal, a man condemned for treason was said to have written his last words not in ink, but in his own blood, painting them across the dungeon wall. The words, translated roughly, were, "May the stone remember what the king forgets." Locals insist that when the palace was demolished, the wall remained, and workmen claimed their tools dulled when striking it, as if the stone itself resisted erasure. Eventually, the wall was buried intact, and today no one knows where it lies. Though some believe the stone still holds his blood, his testimony sealed away in earth. These hidden accounts, scattered across lands and centuries, whisper the same truth. Pain leaves records, no matter how royals try to erase them. The testimonies live on, in blood, in stone, in scraps of ash and bone, waiting for someone willing to listen. For while kings and queens commanded silence, the tortured found ways to speak, and their voices, though faint, reach us still. In the East, under the shadow of a dynasty that lasted centuries, there is said to have been a hall known only to a select few within the palace. Official records describe it as a chamber of balance, a place where disputes were weighed and truth was measured. But the testimonies that trickled down through servants and guards reveal another function entirely. Prisoners accused of treachery or dissent were suspended from elaborate wooden scales, their bodies hanging in counterweights against stones or iron. If their side of the scale did not sink with the force of confession, the torturers would add weights to the other side. Hooks through flesh, blocks of iron bound to limbs, until bones split and joints burst. One scribe, who claimed to have seen such sessions, wrote in secret. Their bodies became a measure of loyalty. Their screams tipped the balance. His notes were discovered after his death, his family stripped of land and name, his words hidden in imperial archives. But fragments survived, copied on rice paper by a monk who could not bear to see them destroyed. From the Middle East, another testimony survives, though barely. A merchant, accused of withholding tribute from the royal treasury, was said to have been placed in a cage of insects. He was stripped, covered in honey, and confined in a wooden box that allowed swarms of flies, ants, and beetles to devour him alive. What little remains of his testimony is a series of prayers scratched in the floor of the box with his teeth, marks so faint they were nearly overlooked when the ruins were uncovered centuries later. The scratches, when magnified, spelled out a plea, if not mercy, then memory. Archaeologists argued over their authenticity, but those who stood before the box in silence swore they could still hear the faint buzzing of wings, even in empty air. Farther west, in the Netherlands, there is record of a testimony whispered by a painter condemned for blasphemy. He had depicted saints with hollow eyes, mouths open in silent screams, and though he swore it was a vision sent by God, the crown declared a heresy. For his punishment, he was strapped into an iron frame that stretched his body while allowing his hands freedom, forcing him to paint as he writhed. His final work was said to be a canvas streaked with blood and tears, images so grotesque that the court demanded to be burned immediately. Yet a rumor spread that a servant tore a fragment from the canvas before the flames consumed it. That fragment, a single eye surrounded by red brushstrokes, surfaced generations later in a private collection, the paint still thick as though it had been wet. Some whispered it was not paint at all, but the residue of his body. His testimony lived on not in words, but in the stare of that painted eye. In Scotland, a testimony is found not in a dungeon or a record, but in a lullaby sung by mothers long after the events were forgotten. It is said that a clan accused of betrayal was chained together and drowned in a loch, each bound by iron weights. Their cries carried across the water for hours before silence finally fell. Survivors, wives, sisters, and children, sang a song of mourning that described the chains dragging bodies down, the bubbles breaking on the surface, the silence that followed. Though the royals banned the song, branding it treason, it survived in whispers. The testimony of the drowned became part of the rhythm of cradles, carried forward until no one remembered the names, only the sorrow. Yet when sung on certain nights, it is said the water stirs, as if those chains still drag below. From North Africa comes a testimony of a scholar who angered a sultan with his writings. He was confined within a great copper drum, which was beaten rhythmically while he suffocated inside. His body was never recovered, but his testimony remained in the notes of a musician who played at the court. The musician described how the drum changed tone as the man inside pressed against it, his final movements creating a rhythm unlike any heard before. The musician wrote, "He played himself into silence, and we all heard it." The testimony lived not in writing, but in sound, a rhythm forbidden but hummed by apprentices who passed it down, until centuries later, it became part of folk songs no one could trace to their source. The most haunting testimonies are those left by children, because they were never supposed to leave anything at all. In a small principality in Eastern Europe, a boy of 9 was accused of carrying secret messages for rebels. He was thrown into a pit with no light, given only scraps of food, until his mind began to unravel. When the pit was cleared years later, they found the walls covered in tiny scratches, at first thought to be meaningless marks. Scholars later recognized them as letters, crude but deliberate. The boy had taught himself to write in the dark by feeling the shapes with his fingers. His final words, carved over and over, were, "Do not let them close the lid." That pit was sealed. Yet when it was reopened, the air inside was so heavy with silence that those who entered swore they heard scratching in the stone. Again and again, the testimonies that should have died live on. They emerge in songs, in paintings, in bones, in the faintest etchings of stone. They survive because pain is not silent. It imprints itself on everything it touches. The royals may have commanded silence, scribes may have burned pages, executioners may have buried their secrets, but still the voices return. Sometimes they whisper through documents scholars stumble upon. Sometimes they echo in lullabies, curses, or half-forgotten prayers. Sometimes they are felt in places where the air itself seems too heavy, as if it carries what was once unspeakable. The forgotten testimonies of torture are not stories of past. They are messages written in agony, carried forward like sparks in ash, refusing to go out. They are reminders that power always fears memory, because memory cannot be destroyed. It only waits. And one day, when the silence cracks, all those voices will rise again, their words sharper than chains, louder than screams, unending as stone.